The question I get asked a lot is, how can you measure knowledge assets? What are knowledge assets and how can you measure them? Because the argument is that you can't measure knowledge. Some argue you can't manage knowledge because we can't see it, feel it, know it to the degree that we can other tangible assets. Well, first of all, let's just look at an asset and then a knowledge asset and then how we might measure them. Everyone in business, management, are tasked with managing the assets that the organization has to the best that they're able to, the best they can. Asset management is not new. If you have plant machinery, people, technologies, land, buildings, these are all assets that must be managed properly. And management of assets involves several things. The maintenance of assets is important, the renewal of assets, the development of assets, the application of these assets to achieve our objectives. But what is interesting with assets is that we can create income from assets if we apply them wisely, and we can create wealth as a result. And remember also that another characteristic of an asset is it has a life cycle. So assets, tangible assets, we can apply our management methods to these assets, and we can measure each of these tangible assets in different ways depending on the types of assets they are, quite easily. So that's assets, generally tangible assets. Knowledge assets are really no different if you think about it, as opposed to just knowledge. A knowledge asset has a life cycle. Knowledge has a life cycle. If you're reading a newspaper, today's news, tomorrow's news is not the same value as today's news. Having a knowledge, as I did as a young man, about a particular computer programming language that I learned, has no value today because there are much better programming languages and easier to apply to the new technologies. So assets, when you look at them, whatever they are, knowledge assets, have a life cycle too. Some have long life cycles and some have short life cycles. We can create income from our knowledge assets. We can create income with our skills. I'll use the example of being a computer programmer again, or a management consultant, which is what I am. I can create income from this. But I have to maintain my knowledge assets. Knowledge is changing all the time. I have to add to, improve, and delete, and remove, and unlearn, if you wish to use that term, where it's needed, so that what I have today is relevant, up to date, and the most valuable to the clients and customers that I work with. So creating value, life cycles, maintaining, it's the same as physical assets. The only question is, well, how do we measure knowledge assets? And typically, around the world, there's a bit of a de facto standard at the moment. There is no definite standard, but many companies that are interested in this area of knowledge asset management, or you might even prefer to use the term intangible assets management, although I make a distinction in other videos between the difference between intellectual capital and intellectual assets and knowledge assets in an organization. But if we wish to measure them, we tend to use the de facto standard of three categories. The first category is our human assets. The second category we call our structural assets. And the third category we call our relational assets, although some people prefer to call them societal assets or social assets. There are quite a few terms, but essentially we're talking about human assets in an organization and structural assets in an organization, and then assets that are outside the organization or gained, developed through working externally with other organizations, which I will call for the moment relational assets. So what are human assets? Well, people, clearly. But we know that human knowledge assets, we have, for example, experts, individual experts, who are very good knowledge assets. They can transfer their knowledge, they can apply their knowledge, they can create knowledge if they are what we would typically call subject matter experts. Individual experts are key knowledge assets. But we also have human knowledge assets like a team. An effective, collaborative, co-creative team is a key knowledge asset. A community of practice is a knowledge asset. Communities of interest, communities of passion, they're all networks of people capable of creating, applying, sharing knowledge. So they are the human knowledge assets. How do we measure them? Well, typically human knowledge assets we can measure several ways, but one way we like to measure individual knowledge, human knowledge assets, are through competencies. A competence, you have to have the knowledge and the skills and the attitude to be competent. The right knowledge, the right skills, the right attitude, and you're competent. And you can have levels of competence, so it's quite easy in an organization to have a competence management system where we record each person's competencies and their levels of competence. And if we were to measure this, let's say, and monitor this, say 6 monthly or annually, we would see those levels of competencies that are rising and those levels of competencies that are reducing perhaps or static. And as people leave the organization, we would see those levels of competence disappear. And as people join the organization, we would see those levels of competences added. So we can actually measure human knowledge assets through competencies, a competence management system and levels of competence quite effectively. And quite a few companies have been doing that for a few years. When we measure teams, effective collaborative teams, we may choose different measurements. One of the measurements I like is in an effective collaborative and co-creative team, if that team come up with, as a result of their team meetings, new learnings and new insights and new ideas, and we capture them to consider at a later date. They're measurements of an effective team, a team that's not actually realizing some new learnings in the organization or getting new insights or new ideas, may not be as effective as a team that is. And you can measure these and show the team performance, another aspect of team performance, this way. You can even take it further. There are several measurements that we've identified, but once you've got these learnings and ideas, and somebody considers them, and actually maybe a subject matter expert is looking at these to see if really we should embed this new learnings and ideas into better organizational knowledge, we use the term for that, make a knowledge nomination. So teams can make knowledge nominations if they truly believe that an organization will benefit from embracing this new knowledge into the institutional or organizational knowledge. You can measure the number of knowledge nominations, you can measure it by team, by organization, by all sorts of different ways, and this is quite an effective measurement. So there are ways to measure human knowledge assets. Structural knowledge assets are those things that our knowledge is embedded in within the organization that's not human beings. If you've embedded knowledge in a strategy, a powerful strategy, I would call that a structural knowledge asset. If you've embedded knowledge in a book, and you may have copyrights, I would call that a structural knowledge asset. If you've embedded knowledge into business processes, a business process, and across the business processes, and documented this, I would call these structural knowledge assets. And all of these things, and patents, all of these things, even the technologies that we use and the software that we use that remain in the organization, I will call those structural knowledge assets. And for each of these different types of assets, as you can imagine, we can measure them. They're tangible, and not just the number of patents and the number of copyrights. We can go much deeper and far more meaningfully into this whole notion of how to measure structural knowledge assets. And I'll refer to our book at the end, which gives you far more examples and details of how you can measure each of these different types of knowledge assets. The third category, relational knowledge assets, are not as easy to measure sometimes, but can be measured. And relational knowledge assets could be those assets that we value in our organization, working externally with our customers and our clients and our partners, for example, and our suppliers. Relationships, I would call them, trusting relationships, I would call them a relational knowledge asset. This leads on to the power of brands which are based on trust, and these can be measured. And so knowledge assets, in our opinion, are as tangible as what we would typically call the typical tangible knowledge assets of an organization. Knowledge may be intangible, yes, but knowledge assets, those assets that might create knowledge, share knowledge, transfer knowledge, apply knowledge, they're tangible and they're measurable. And that's why we have developed a knowledge asset management methodology to enable the organization not just to report on its financial assets through its accounting systems and its balance sheets and profit and loss, which are vital, of course, but tend to present a picture of the past, what's happened in the past. In addition, an organization can now report on and manage and measure its knowledge assets, its human knowledge assets, its structural knowledge assets, its relational knowledge assets, as well as its financial assets. And the good thing about managing knowledge assets is that we're looking more to the future, not just to the past, and how we're managing our key assets in the organization. In 1998, now, quite a while ago, I was part of a European Commission research project, collaborative research project, which consisted of partners like Ernst & Young, INSEAD Business School, Knowledge Associates, our company, DFKI, which was the German Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, to name the four key participants. We researched this whole area of knowledge asset management. Over several years, we developed the methodology, what at that time was called KnowNet. And we published all of our results, all of our findings, our methodology, how we measure, in a book which is still available today. It's published by Springer. It's available from them and on Amazon. It's called simply Knowledge Asset Management. And I, Ron Young, am one of the authors. The principles of knowledge asset management have not changed. They are as applicable today in 2016 as when we first discovered them in 1999-2000. Principles are timeless. They're not going to change. The way we apply the principles will change because tools and technologies and methods and processes improve. But the fundamental principles of knowledge asset management are the same. And to all the organizations that are out there that are looking at better ways to manage their assets in the organization, both to become more transformational and to improve the operations, so it's both a strategic perspective and an operational perspective, I would recommend that you look at knowledge asset management as an approach in your organization as to equip us much better in a growing global knowledge economy. If you'd like to know much more detail about this, then I would recommend you contact me, Ron Young, at knowledge-associates.com, or go onto our website, www.knowledge-associates.com, and we'll be glad to help as best we can.